The rancher stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the woman inside the locked cabin he hadn't entered in 5 years. Snow hammered the cabin roof while a silver necklace slipped from the rancher's coat and struck the wooden floor with a sharp clink. The woman looked down. Inside the pendant was the picture of a little girl. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. But inside that tiny cabin, something far more dangerous had just been uncovered. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from. The autumn wind swept dust across Main Street in Red Hollow, Montana, rattling the loose sign outside the feed store and carrying the smell of horses, leather, and coal smoke from the train depot. Rosalie Reed stood at the back of the church hall with both hands wrapped around a faded cloth bag. The bag wasn't worth much. A spare dress, a hairbrush missing 3 teeth, a folded photograph of her mother. That was nearly everything she owned. The room around her was slowly emptying. One by one, ranch owners had chosen workers for the coming winter. A strong farmhand, a cook, a stable boy, a seamstress. Every name had been called except hers. The pastor glanced down at his list again. Then he folded the paper. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Rosalie felt her stomach sink. That was it. The meeting was over. Outside, wagon wheels rolled across the dirt road. Someone laughed near the doorway. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as people prepared to leave. Nobody looked at her, not directly, but she could feel it. The quick glances, the hesitation, the silent decision to keep moving. 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off a train from St. Louis, believing she could start over. 3 weeks later, she was sleeping wherever she could find shelter. A church bench, a storage shed, the corner of a boarding house porch. Anywhere the cold couldn't quite reach. The pastor cleared his throat. "May the Lord watch over all of you this winter." Several people nodded. Men reached for their hats. Rosalie lowered her eyes. She could already picture another night outside. The first snow wasn't far away. She knew that. Everyone did. A ranch owner near the front muttered something to another man. The second man shook his head. Neither bothered lowering their voices enough. Too much trouble. Rosalie heard it. So did everyone else. She stared at the floorboards. For a moment, she considered walking away, leaving before anyone could see how badly it hurt. Then she thought about the nights already spent in the cold. She thought about the last letter from St. Louis, accusing her of theft. She thought about the woman who had replaced her employer, and decided blame was easier than truth. Something inside her refused to stay quiet. Before she could change her mind, Rosalie stepped forward. The room slowed. A few people stopped gathering their things. She stood near the front now. The afternoon sunlight, coming through the church windows, caught the dust floating in the air. Her fingers tightened around the cloth bag. When she spoke, her voice almost failed her. "Please." Several heads turned. Rosalie swallowed, then tried again. "Please take me." Silence spread through the room. She felt heat rise to her face. But she kept going. "Just give me one chance." Nobody moved. The pastor looked uncomfortable. A woman near the door lowered her eyes. Rosalie waited 1 second, 2, 5. The silence became unbearable. She could hear the wind pushing against the church walls. A clock ticking somewhere near the back. The sound of her own breathing. Then a chair creaked. A man stood. Rosalie had noticed him earlier only because he sat alone. Tall, broad shoulders, dark coat dusted with trail dirt. A weathered face marked by years beneath the Montana sun. Elias Turner. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the name. Owner of Cedar Ridge Ranch. The widowed rancher who rarely came to town unless business required it. He didn't look at the crowd. Didn't look at the pastor. Didn't seem interested in what anyone else thought. His eyes settled on Rosalie. Calm, steady, almost unreadable. Then he spoke. "You're the woman I've been waiting for." The room went completely still. A ranch owner near the door blinked. Another man frowned. Someone whispered Elias's name under their breath. Rosalie wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Neither was anyone else. Elias reached for his hat. If she's willing, I've got work. The pastor stared at him. Mr. Turner, are you certain? Elias nodded once. I wouldn't have stood up if I wasn't. Nobody argued. Nobody knew what to say. Rosalie felt her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. For the first time in weeks, the ground beneath her feet felt solid. Elias picked up his coat. I'll be leaving before dark. He looked at her. You can ride with me if you want. Not if you need to. Not if you have nowhere else. If you want. The choice mattered. Rosalie noticed that. She nodded. Thank you. He tipped his hat slightly. Nothing more. The meeting ended. Outside, the sky stretched wide and pale above Red Hollow. Cloud shadows moved across the distant mountains. Elias's wagon waited near the church. A pair of chestnut horses stamped their feet against the dirt. Rosalie climbed onto the bench seat carefully. She expected questions. There were none. Expected curiosity. There was none of that either. Elias clicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward. The town slowly disappeared behind them. For a long while, neither spoke. The road west wound through open grassland where golden autumn weeds bent beneath the wind. The mountains stood blue against the horizon. Rosalie watched them in silence. The farther they traveled, the smaller Red Hollow became. Eventually, Elias reached into his coat pocket. He pulled something out. A small silver necklace. Old enough that most of the shine had disappeared. The chain was worn smooth. The tiny pendant caught the fading sunlight. Without seeming aware of it, Elias rubbed his thumb across it. Once, twice, again. The same way a person might touch an old scar. Rosalie looked away before he noticed. Minutes passed. Then she glanced back. The necklace was still in his hand. His gaze fixed on the distant mountains, far away. Lost somewhere she couldn't see. The wind moved through the grass. The wagon wheels creaked. A hawk circled high above the valley. Rosalie wondered who the necklace belonged to. A daughter, a sister, someone he loved, someone he lost. But she didn't ask. The silence between them didn't feel cold, only careful, as if both carried things too heavy for strangers. The sun was beginning to sink when the mountains grew larger ahead. Cedar Ridge Ranch waited somewhere beyond them. Rosalie looked down at the cloth bag resting in her lap. A few hours earlier, she had been the woman nobody wanted. Now she was riding toward a future she could not see. Beside her, Elias Turner closed his hand around the old necklace once more. And neither of them knew that this quiet road through the Montana wilderness was about to change both their lives forever. The sun had slipped behind the mountains by the time they reached Cedar Ridge Ranch. The road narrowed between tall pines. Shadows stretched across the ground. The smell of cold earth drifted through the evening air. Rosalie spotted the ranch gate first. The sign hanging above it creaked softly in the wind. Cedar Ridge. The paint was fading. A lantern burned near the main barn, its glow small against the growing darkness. Elias guided the wagon through the gate. Neither horse hurried. The place seemed tired, not broken, just tired, like it had spent years waiting for something. The ranch house stood at the center of the property. A long porch wrapped around the front. Several windows were dark. The barn leaned slightly toward the north fence. A water trough sat half empty. Nothing looked neglected enough to be abandoned. Yet nothing looked cared for either. Rosalie climbed down from the wagon. The mountain air felt colder than anything she remembered from St. Louis. Elias carried her bag before she could reach for it. I've got it, she nodded. He led her toward the house. The front door opened with a soft groan. Warmth did not greet her. Silence did. The kitchen table was clean but bare. No flowers, no books, no signs of company. Only a coffee mug beside the sink and a pair of work gloves hanging from a nail. Elias set her bag beside a small bedroom near the back. The room's yours. Rosalie stepped inside. A narrow bed, a dresser, a wash basin. A quilt folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. The room wasn't beautiful, but it was hers. For tonight at least, that alone felt like a gift. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "Supper's on the stove." Then he disappeared down the hallway. The house settled back into silence. Later that night, Rosalie sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of beef stew warming her hands. Rain tapped softly against the window. The lamp beside her cast a small circle of light. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't wondering where she would sleep. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt curious. The house carried memories. You could sense them. Pictures had once hung on the walls. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace. One corner of the room looked untouched for years, as if someone had walked away and nobody had been willing to disturb the space afterward. The next morning she woke before sunrise. Habit. The ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of horses shifting in the barn. Rosalie pulled on her boots and stepped outside. Frost covered the grass. The mountains glowed pale blue beneath the morning sky. She walked around the property slowly. The closer she looked, the more she noticed. Fence posts needed repair. Paint peeled from the porch rail. Dead vines tangled around a neglected vegetable garden. Then she saw it. A small cabin standing beyond the main house. Hidden near a cluster of pine trees, its windows were covered. A heavy lock hung from the door. Rosalie stopped. The cabin looked older than everything else. Older and strangely untouched. A narrow path led toward it, yet grass had grown through most of the trail. She studied it for a moment, then heard footsteps behind her. Elias stood near the porch. His expression changed the instant he noticed where she was looking. Not anger, something quieter, something harder. He turned away almost immediately. "Breakfast is ready." Rosalie looked back toward the cabin. Then at him, she asked no questions. He offered no answers. By noon, she had already found work to do. The kitchen shelves needed cleaning. The pantry needed organizing. The coffee beans were stored beside lamp oil. The flour sacks sat open. Nothing was impossible, only neglected. She tied back her sleeves and got started. 2 days later, the smell of fresh biscuits drifted through the house. One of the ranch hands stopped halfway through the doorway. Another followed the smell into the kitchen. Neither man said much, but both cleaned their plates. By the end of the week, Rosalie had repaired torn curtains, organized supplies, and somehow convinced a nervous young horse to let her clean a wound near its leg. The ranch hands began greeting her by name. Small changes, nothing dramatic, yet Cedar Ridge felt different, as though someone had opened a window after years of stale air. One afternoon, an older woman arrived in a wagon pulled by a gray mule. She wore a dark coat and carried a basket covered with a towel. "Martha Bell," she said. Her smile appeared before her handshake. "I live on the neighboring ranch." Rosalie invited her inside. Martha looked around the kitchen, then laughed softly. "Well, I'll be. What? I haven't seen this house look alive in years." Rosalie glanced toward the window. "Elias keeps it well enough." Martha's eyes softened. "He keeps it standing." That was different. Before leaving, Martha paused near the porch. "Before all this happened, there used to be music here." Rosalie looked up. "What happened?" Martha simply shook her head. "That's Elias's story to tell." The days passed. Cold settled deeper into the valley. The first traces of winter appeared on the mountain peaks. One night, Rosalie woke suddenly. The house was dark. The fire had burned low. At first, she thought the sound came from a dream. Then she heard it again, a harmonica, soft, distant, playing somewhere outside. She sat up, listened carefully. The melody drifted through the darkness, lonely, slow, almost mournful. Rosalie stepped to the window. Moonlight covered the ranch. The sound came again, and this time she knew exactly where it was coming from. The locked cabin. She stared through the glass. The cabin sat motionless beneath the trees. No lantern, no movement, only the faint music floating across the cold night air. Then it stopped, abruptly, as if someone had closed a door. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Rosalie remained at the window for a long moment. The moonlight silvered the frost on the ground. Nothing moved, not a shadow, not a figure, nothing. The next morning she walked past the cabin on her way to the barn. The lock still hung on the door, undisturbed. No footprints, no signs anyone had entered. She stood there quietly. The cold wind moved through the pine trees overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. And for the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge Ranch, Rosalie realized that the greatest mystery on the property was not the quiet rancher who had brought her here. It was the locked cabin he could not bear to look at. And somehow she knew the answer waiting behind that door would change everything. Winter arrived slowly across the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow gathered first on the distant peaks, then along the fence lines, and finally in the shadows beneath the pine trees surrounding Cedar Ridge Ranch. The mornings grew colder. Every day before sunrise, Rosalie found a fresh stack of split firewood waiting outside her door. She never saw Elias leave it there. He was always gone before she woke. The first time she thought it was coincidence. The fifth time she knew better. One morning she discovered the draft coming through a crack beneath her bedroom window had disappeared. A new strip of wood had been fitted perfectly into place. No note, no explanation, just fixed. Another week passed. A pair of sturdy leather boots appeared beside the kitchen table, after her old ones finally split near the sole. Rosalie carried them into the barn that afternoon. Elias was repairing a saddle strap. "You bought these?" He glanced up once. The store had a sale. The price tag still attached. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Then I suppose they forgot to take it off." Rosalie looked at him for a second longer than necessary. Neither said anything else, but something warm settled quietly between them. By December, people in town had begun noticing the changes at Cedar Ridge. The ranch looked alive again. Smoke rose from the chimney every evening. The fences stood straighter. The horses looked healthier. And that was exactly what bothered Beatrice Langford. She watched from across the street as Rosalie stepped out of the general store carrying flour and coffee. Beatrice's smile never reached her eyes. By the following Sunday, whispers had begun. At church, at the diner, at the feed store. Nobody repeated the same story twice, but every version ended the same way. Rosalie was only staying until she could claim something that belonged to Elias. The rumors spread faster than snow clouds. Rosalie heard them. She pretended she didn't. Then came the winter festival. Lanterns hung above Main Street. Children skated across the frozen pond. Fiddles played inside the town hall. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Until Beatrice spoke, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Funny how some people arrive with nothing and suddenly find themselves living on the finest ranch in the valley. The conversation around them faded. People stopped moving. Rosalie stood still. The paper cup of coffee in her hand suddenly felt heavier. Beatrice folded her arms. "I suppose some folks know exactly how to make themselves useful." Nobody defended Rosalie. Nobody challenged Beatrice. The silence hurt more than the words. Then a chair scraped across the wooden floor. Elias stood. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes had hardened. He crossed the room slowly, stopped beside Rosalie, and faced the crowd. "None of you were there when this ranch was dying." The hall fell silent. Elias looked directly at the people who had been whispering. She was. Nobody spoke. Nobody even tried. A few lowered their eyes. Beatrice's face lost its color. Elias took Rosalie's coffee cup before it spilled from her trembling hand. "Let's go home." Outside, snow had started falling. Large flakes drifted through the lantern light. The ride back was quiet, but not uncomfortable. For the first since arriving in Montana, Rosalie felt something stronger than gratitude. She felt protected. The blizzard arrived after midnight. Wind slammed against the ranch house. Snow piled against the barn doors. Near dawn, one of the ranch hands burst inside. A horse is missing. A valuable stallion had broken through part of the north fence. Without hesitation, Rosalie grabbed her coat. "I'm going." "You'll never find him in this weather," the ranch hand warned. But she was already moving. An hour later, the storm swallowed her tracks. And when evening came, Rosalie Reed had not returned. Elias stood on the porch, staring into the white wall of snow. Then he reached for his saddle. For the first time in years, fear showed plainly on his face, and he rode straight into the storm. The wind hit like a wall. Snow swirled across the valley, erasing fences, trails, and landmarks. Elias pulled his coat tighter and urged his horse forward. The lantern hanging from his saddle threw a weak circle of light that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He searched the north pasture first, then the creek crossing, then the old logging road that wound into the hills. Nothing, only snow, only wind. Hours passed. The storm grew worse. Twice his horse nearly lost its footing. By midnight, Elias had ridden farther than any sensible man would have. Still, he kept going. Rosalie's empty chair at the kitchen table stayed in his mind. The sound of her laughter with the ranch hands. The way she always left a fresh pot of coffee warming near the stove. He could not lose another person. Not again. Near dawn, he spotted movement through the storm. A horse, the missing stallion, and beyond it a small hunting cabin, half buried beneath snow. Elias jumped from the saddle and pushed through the drifts. Inside, Rosalie lay wrapped in old blankets beside a cold fireplace. Alive, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Relief hit him so hard he had to sit down for a moment. "Rosalie." Her eyes opened slowly. "Elias?" The sound of his name nearly broke him. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her outside. The ride home felt endless. For 2 days, she barely left her bed. Martha Bell came to help. The ranch hands kept the work moving. Elias checked on Rosalie more often than he realized. Sometimes bringing tea, sometimes adding wood to the fire. Sometimes simply standing in the doorway to make sure she was still there. On the third morning, while helping her sit up, something slipped from his coat pocket. A silver necklace. The same one Rosalie had seen on the wagon. The pendant sprang open when it hit the floor. Inside was a tiny photograph. A little girl with bright eyes and dark curls. Rosalie froze. Elias picked it up carefully. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he closed the pendant and slipped it back into his pocket. His face became unreadable again. But the silence between them had changed. A week later, a powerful windstorm swept through Cedar Ridge. One of the gusts slammed against the old cabin behind the house. The rusted lock finally gave way. Rosalie discovered the broken chain that afternoon. She stood outside the door for several minutes before stepping inside. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. A small rocking horse rested near the wall. Children's books sat neatly on a shelf. A tiny chair, a faded quilt, family photographs. And on a table beside the window lay an old harmonica, the same sound she had heard that night. Rosalie touched nothing. She simply stood there. When Elias walked through the doorway an hour later, she expected anger. Instead, he stopped, looked around the room, and quietly sat down. The years seemed to settle onto his shoulders all at once. "My wife died 5 years ago." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Pneumonia." Rosalie listened. A long silence followed. Then he looked toward the rocking horse. "Our daughter died a few months later." The room became very still. "I locked this place and kept waiting for the pain to leave." His eyes remained fixed on the floor. It never did. Rosalie said nothing. No advice, no comfort, no promise. She simply sat beside him. The late afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias Turner was not alone with his grief. Neither of them noticed the folded papers hidden inside an old desk drawer near the back wall. Papers that would soon reveal a scheme powerful enough to threaten everything Cedar Ridge Ranch stood for. Winter finally loosened its grip on the valley. Snow retreated from the lower fields. Water rushed through the creek behind the ranch. The first patches of green appeared across the hillsides. Life was returning. For a little while, it felt as though peace had returned too. Then the letter arrived. A rider from town delivered it just after breakfast. Elias read it once, then again. His jaw tightened. Rosalie noticed immediately. "What is it?" Elias handed her the paper. A hearing had been scheduled before the town council. A claim had been filed against Cedar Ridge Ranch. An old debt. A large one. Large enough to cost Elias a significant portion of his land. "It doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "I paid every debt I ever owed." The hearing took place 3 days later. The council chamber above the general store was packed. Ranchers lined the walls. Shopkeepers filled the back rows. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Beatrice Langford sat near the front beside a sharply dressed land investor named Calvin Mercer. The moment Rosalie saw them exchange a glance, something felt wrong. Mercer presented the documents. Old debt records, signed agreements, payment notices. Everything appeared legitimate. The council members studied the papers carefully. Several looked concerned. Elias remained calm, but Rosalie could see the strain around his eyes. Then she noticed something. One signature, a familiar name. The same name she had seen days earlier inside the locked cabin. She remembered the letters stored in the old desk, the papers, the records, the correspondence Elias's wife had carefully preserved. Rosalie stood. "I need a little time." The room turned toward her. By sunset, she was back at Cedar Ridge, searching through the desk. Page after page, receipt after receipt, old letters tied with ribbon. Then she found it. A ranch ledger. The handwriting matched. The dates matched. But the signature on Mercer's document did not. One letter was wrong. Small. Almost invisible. Yet wrong. The next morning she returned to town carrying the ledger. The council compared both documents side by side. The room grew quiet, then quieter. Finally, the chairman looked up. "The debt papers are forged." A murmur swept through the crowd. Mercer's face drained of color. Beatrice stared in disbelief. Within minutes, the entire scheme collapsed. The claim was dismissed. Mercer left town before sunset. Beatrice's reputation went with him. Several weeks later, spring settled fully across the valley. Wildflowers covered the hills. The creek ran clear beneath the cottonwoods. One afternoon, Elias led Rosalie to the highest ridge overlooking Cedar Ridge Ranch. The entire property stretched beneath them. The barn, the fields, the cabin. The house that no longer felt empty. Elias handed her a folded document. She opened it slowly. Part ownership of the ranch. Her name written beside his. Rosalie looked up in surprise. Then he handed her a small iron key, the cabin key. The final thing he offered was the silver necklace. The one he had carried every day. Rosalie shook her head. "You should keep this." Elias closed her fingers around it. "I've been carrying the past long enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the grass around them. Then Rosalie opened the cloth bag she had carried since Red Hollow. Inside were dozens of folded papers, rejected job applications, denied references, dismissal notices, years of closed doors. The first one read, "Position denied." The final paper rested at the bottom. A note written in Elias's hand on the day she arrived. "Welcome home." Months later, summer sunlight filled Cedar Ridge Ranch. Flowers bloomed around the cabin. Children laughed in the distance while ranch hands repaired fences. The cabin door stood open. The house stood open too. One evening, Rosalie and Elias sat together on the porch, watching the valley turn gold beneath the setting sun. Neither rushed to fill the silence, neither needed to. At last Elias spoke. "You never had to beg for a place here." Rosalie looked across the land that had once belonged to a stranger. Then at the man beside her. For the first time in many years, she wasn't searching for somewhere to belong. She already had. And in the quiet light of a Montana summer evening, both of them finally understood that sometimes home is not a place waiting for you. Sometimes it is a person. As the sun slipped behind the mountains and the shadows stretched across Cedar Ridge Ranch, there was nothing dramatic left to happen. No grand speeches, no crowds, no applause. Just two people sitting on a porch, listening to the wind move through the grass. And maybe that's why this story stays with us. Because if we're honest, most of us have known what it feels like to stand where Rosalie once stood, to wonder if there is a place for us, to carry old disappointments a little longer than we should, to keep walking even when every closed door makes the road feel heavier. And maybe some of us have been like Elias too, holding on to grief so tightly that we forget life is still waiting outside the door. What I love about this story is that neither of them rescued the other with perfect words. They showed up, day after day, through silence, patience, kindness, and trust. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it looks like a warm meal, a stack of firewood, a chair left open beside you. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, quiet courage, lasting love, and the people who help us find our way home, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you.